And I think that's all the announcements for now.
Cool. Okay, so give it 1 second, Laura and Matt. Let's let the room fill in a little bit, and then let me make sure we're streaming, and then we can get started.
Sounds good.
Let's just see. I think we should be good, but let me just triple check. Okay.
Looks like it.
Yeah, looks like we're live. Okay, perfect. All right, let's get started then. Yeah, hi Diane. Perfect. Okay. So everybody who's joining us on social media, we just did some quick announcements. I have some introductions to do. Today we have two awesome doctors, one of which you know, one of which you may know, and super excited for this topic that we're going to be discussing. We're going to be talking about Christopher Gardner and Stanford and the studies that they've put out over the past 2 decades and potentially some of the issues facing some of them. So I'm very excited to be talking about this also because Chris Gardner is on the new USDA guidelines committee for 2025, which makes this topic even more interesting. You may be seeing some hearings in the Senate. You may be seeing some hearings in Capitol Hill talking about the conflicts of interest in medicine, in nutrition. And I think the more we educate and we talk about these things, the better off we'll all be. So I'm super excited to talk about the biases in the nutrition literature and what the headlines say versus what the studies say. And sometimes even what the conclusions say on the paper and what the studies say. So the topic is about Christopher Gardner and Stanford, and I'm happy you guys are all joining us. And today I'm going to do some brief introductions. We have Dr. Matt Calkins, who is a board-certified family medicine doctor, a board-certified obesity medicine doctor, and he works in a clinic in North Carolina with One Health and a metabolic clinic. Super excited for his practice there. And then we have Dr. Laura Buchanan, who's been working with us. Has it been 2 years? Oh gosh, it's coming on, yeah, something like that, 2 years.
Yeah.
And she's also board certified in family medicine and obesity medicine, and soon to be, I believe, NAMS certified, hopefully, crossing fingers there.
No doubt.
And we are all metabolic health practitioners, and we are both all very active in the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners. Guys, thank you so much for coming and talking to all of us about the biases in nutrition. And if you asked me 10 years ago, hey, are the guidelines biased, or are there issues with the guidelines? I would have said, I don't know of any. And I'm sure after you hear some of what we talk about today, that you'll have some questions or maybe some concerns at the least. So before we get started, do you guys want to just sort of give any comments about what we're about to talk about?
I'm excited to talk about this because, I mean, you mentioned it, but there is unfortunately a lot of bias, and I see this still on a weekly basis in new articles that are being published. I feel like every time I turn around, there's an article that says low carb increases heart disease risk, or low carb associated with higher LDL associated with heart disease risk. And you never see these big headlines that show the reality of low carb reverses diabetes. And those are the headlines that we should be seeing, and that would make a huge impact on people's lives instead of continuing to create this fear surrounding low carb diets.
Mm-hmm. And the specific type of, I think, bias we're going to look at is called white hat bias, which is when researchers think for the greater good that it's basically through publication bias. So they selectively publish or selectively change their methodology to maybe consciously or subconsciously try to get the results they want. And we're going to review 4 studies, and I'll review the first 2, Laura will review the third one, and then Tro, you got the last one. And hopefully we're going to walk you through this period in time to show how this can evolve, I think, in the if you just look at the studies themselves, I think it paints a pretty good picture of that.
Well, the one thing before we get started is, maybe the listener right now or somebody's participating from social media, they oftentimes I say things that are very rambunctious on social media. I posted a South Park clip recently where they were joking about flipping the food pyramid upside down. But I couldn't help but think that, gosh, maybe it's actually accurate. And, I think when you talk about these things, about the influence of corporate influence and regulatory capture, I think it's really hard for people to understand. And it's almost easy for people to dismiss. But for those of us who read the literature, read the nutritional literature, you really see underneath the hood. And now more and more, these studies are coming out. In 2022, Nina Teicholz, wrote an amazing article about Chris Gardner's biases. And they published into a journal regarding public health all the conflicts of interest in the nutrition landscape, particularly in the Dietary Guidelines Committee. Similarly, Gary Ruskin has done similar things with U.S. Right to Know. He's highlighted the influence of the Global Energy Balance Network and how they've paid off different scientists throughout the world, and some of the scientists and clinicians that are writing our guidelines. So when we talk about this, we can point you to very specific research to make this very, very real. It is a very real thing. It's not a conspiracy. This isn't something that's just sort of fear-mongering. There's 2 published papers in the peer-reviewed literature looking at the food industry's influence, and there was one published in the BMJ just this week talking about the conflicts of interest from the public health experts on nutrition in the UK and their influence from industry. So these are 3 articles that we'll sort of post in our app so you can see this information for yourself. The 2022 paper from Nina Teicholz, regarding the conflicts of interest on nutrition, and the Gary Ruskin's U.S. Right to Know Global Energy Balance Network paper from 2020, and then just this week the UK government NHS conflicts of interest paper, and these are published in very well-regarded journals. So this is very real, and you're going to see today, we're going to peel back that curtain, and we're going to walk you through the science from one prominent researcher. And what gets me excited about today is now this very prominent, very well-respected researcher who has done some good work, he is now on the USDA, and in fact, I think he's a chair of one of the subcommittees. He is now leading the dietary guidelines for 2025, which makes bringing this information out even more important. So I'm stoked. Sorry for that long monologue. I know I talk a lot.
I think it was a good introduction. It paints the
Mac, why don't you guys go ahead and take it over and walk us through?
All right, let me share screen here and we'll get going.
All
right, yeah.
All right, excellent. So I'll take the first part here. So we're going to talk just like what Tro talked about, bias against keto. And the question I want to ask is, how did we go from this? So this is a quote from Chris Gardner in the A to Z trial, and we're going to talk about what that trial looked at in a second. But essentially, a low carbohydrate, high protein, high fat diet may be considered a feasible alternative recommendation for weight loss. So how did we go from that to basically this, which is him in 2024 saying, in Newsweek, I do not recommend a ketogenic diet, whereas a little bit less than 2 decades ago, he did. So that's where a lot of this confusion comes from. The studies themselves are, some of the studies actually have good methodology. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but the media will definitely run with a lot of these, and that does create a lot of confusion. So you'll see the low fat versus the low carb headlines. You'll see the keto versus the Mediterranean diet headlines. And overall, unless you are really adept at reading these papers, it's basically really difficult to parse out for the average person. And almost always, you're the average clinician is not going to be able to help you because they may not even know these studies exist, and the how to read these studies is just not something that I think a lot of even clinicians focus on nowadays. So using a ketogenic diet to improve metabolic health is evidence-based and endorsed by many professional organizations. It's endorsed by the American Diabetes Association, it's endorsed by the American Heart Association, and it's endorsed by the Obesity Medicine Association to treat a variety of metabolic diseases. So why is there this much confusion? So we're going to walk through time. We'll start in 2007 with the A to Z trial, which ultimately showed that low carb keto Atkins, as they called it back then, was good. It actually was the best diet of everything that they tested out of the four. We'll go to 2018 and look at diet fits, which basically showed a low carb diet was equal to a low fat diet. Laura will go over Keto Med, which was published in 2022. In my opinion, one of the most egregious examples of poor methodology. And then, of course, there's the twin study that was published late last year and had that Netflix special, which Tro will go over. And that one, of course, showed that vegan was better than omnivore eating meat. So A to Z was published in 2007. Christopher Gardner is the first author here. And essentially, this was a study that had 311 women. I think they were aged 20 to 50, so premenopausal. And they randomized the women to either Atkins, Zone, Learn, or Ornish. So in that order, that's less than 50 grams of carbs. Zone is about 40% calories as carbs. Learn is a little bit more. Learn is basically based on the guidelines. And then Ornish is the very typical less than 10% fat, basically very whole food plant-based for that one. And this, if you were to think, if I were to ask somebody, just make me a randomized controlled trial that pits two dietary patterns against each other, this would be it. They followed up with people weekly for a couple of months, and then they also had 12-month follow-up. But you literally just had the dietary intervention, you had your goals of the macronutrients you wanted to get to, you had the follow-up, and you had the weight loss measured at the end. And so what did it show? The triangles here are the Atkins group, and at every single point, Atkins lost more weight than the other three. Zone, Learn, and Ornish had no statistically significant difference. Atkins at 2, 6, and 12 months had more weight loss. So in their discussion, this is a quote from them. Women assigned to the diet with the lowest carbohydrate content, the Atkins diet, had more weight loss and more favorable changes in related metabolic risk factors like glucose, insulin, things like that at 2 and 6 months and 12 months. And then regarding the LDL, actually, they said no adverse effects on the lipid variables for women following the Atkins diets when compared with the other diets. So literally no changes in the lipids between the Atkins and even the Ornish diets. We're still with more weight loss. So for their conclusion, basically, I'll just read this quote. In this study of overweight and obese premenopausal women, those assigned to follow the Atkins diet had more weight loss and more favorable outcomes for metabolic effects at 1 year than women assigned to the Zone, Ornish, or Learn diets. Concerns about adverse metabolic effects of the Atkins diet were not substantiated within the 12-month study period. This is his quote that I just read. A low carbohydrate, high protein, high fat diet may be considered a feasible alternative recommendation for weight loss. That's from the abstract of this paper. So then this is where we start to get into the weeds a little bit. So that the hypothetical question is, give me the perfect RCT to measure two dietary patterns, pit them together. And really that's A to Z. Diet Fits, we're starting to mix it up. And Diet Fits it's not a bad study for what it wanted to look at, but I think what the ultimate outcome, how they presented the outcome and ultimately how the media presented it is problematic. So this one was published in 2018, and Christopher Gardner is still the lead author. This was a single site randomized control trial. This had 600 people in it. About 80% of those completed it, and it was also 12 months. And was it really low carb versus low fat? Well, if you go into the supplement, this is exactly what this is exactly their rationale for doing what they did. So they did want to look at low carb and low fat, but they wanted to have people at a spread of percentages of low carb and low fat. So to read this part that's highlighted, the rate of restriction was not critical to the study. They tried to get everybody to either less than 20 grams of carbs or less than 20 grams of fat per day, depending on which group they're in. And that reaching the 20 grams per day in 2 versus 4 versus 6 versus 8 weeks was not considered to carry any advantage or disadvantage. This was not a true, let's put you on an Atkins diet like A to Z was. This is a, here's what we kind of want you to do, but if you can't get there, that's okay. Just try to restrict your carbs or your fats. And then we're going to just see if there's different levels of carbs or fat that work for people. Specifically, the thing that they were looking at was how does this interact with genetics and how does this interact with insulin resistance? And so they wanted to have these spreads of macronutrients to look at, to answer those questions. So in fact, they have this strategy. That was the limbo part. Then they had the titrate part. They actually told participants to increase carbs and fats in their diet, depending on which group they're in. So if you're low carb, they want you to add in more carbs. They want you to add in 5 to 15 grams of carbs a day for periods of week at a time with no end date, and no end goal for that. So you could theoretically go back to your normal diet. So let's summarize that. The goal was less than 20 grams of fat or carbs per day. It was acceptable to not hit that goal. Reduction could happen over months, and you can add back in anything at any time. And both groups eliminated sugar, refined grains, and trans fats. Ultimately, that's a good thing for everybody. And then they said the central study hypothesis that each of the study diets would be easier for some participants to maintain and more difficult for others based on some combination of genetic or metabolic predisposition. So that is actually what the study was looking at. It wasn't a true low carb versus low fat study. So if you just look at how many people were eating carbs at the end of the study here, at 12 months, which was the end, the people in the low fat diet were eating 212 grams of carbs, and the people in the low carb diet were eating 132. And the fat was 57 grams in the low fat diet and 86 grams in the low carb diet. So there was a difference between the two. And in the groups themselves, there probably was a pretty good spread. But it was not, again, a true low carb versus low fat diet like A to Z was. And then thankfully, everybody did reduce their sugars, but still people in the low carb group on that bottom right there, still at 12 months had 23 grams of sugar, 22.8 grams of added sugar a day. So again, truly not a keto, truly not an Atkins, truly not a low carb diet. Weight, everybody lost weight, which is great. There was no difference between them. Everybody lost body fat percent. People lost waist circumference. There basically was no difference between anybody, maybe a little bit of difference in the actual baseline HDL for the low carb group. A little bit of difference between the groups for LDL, about 5 milligrams per deciliter, and triglycerides were markedly different, actually, about 20 milligram per deciliter difference in triglycerides between the groups. So in their conclusion, in this 12-month weight loss diet study, there was no significant difference in weight change between a healthy low-fat diet and a healthy low-carb diet, and neither genotype pattern nor baseline insulin secretion was associated with dietary effects on weight loss. In the context of these two common weight loss diet approaches, neither of the two hypothesized predisposing factors was helpful in identifying which diet was better for whom. And then, of course, you have the media running away with this and basically making different conclusions than what they ultimately wanted to test. So there was, if the media wanted to really report this correctly, they would have said that your genetics or your insulin does not help you with a low carb or low fat diet. It doesn't help you maintain it. And that's really the only thing this study showed. This was not a true low carb versus low fat study, yet here we are. And so I wanted to give one more example of the media from this one. This is actually, examine.com is actually a website I use a lot. It has a lot of great information on supplements that I use if a patient has asked me questions. It's actually very evidence-based. And this is basically their conclusion as well. Low fat versus low carb doesn't matter. I think A to Z already proved that it does. And this is where we're at as of 2018 with this study. And Laura will take over, in my opinion, the even more egregious keto med study.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. So
Interject really quick here. Just sorry, quick interjection. When you look at the weight loss at 3 and 6 months, it's actually greater for the low carb group. It was just at 12 months where it was statistically significant at 3 and 6 months. And it was just at 12 months where it barely was not statistically significant. the low carb group. So I think part of the problem was the recommendation in that group to basically add back carbohydrates or add back fat as they saw fit, or basically as low as they could tolerate. So I think the dietary recommendation, which was not to keep going and keep sort of pursuing, it promoted this regression to the mean, so to speak, like just go back to what you can tolerate. So that was another interesting point that I found with this diet trial, which everybody concluded meant that low fat and low carb were equal, when in fact at 3 and 6 months you lost more weight with a low carb approach. And really, by the end of it, there was a teaspoon or tablespoon difference in the added sugar. It was almost comical.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No.
I don't know if you guys felt that way too, felt the same things.
No. Yeah, exactly. I think you exactly were right. The regression to mean, because that is how your protocol was created. I think what we're going to see in KetoMed as well is the protocol really drove this other study. One other thing that I wanted to mention about diet fits, some of this is over my head, so you may know a little bit more about this, or we can just leave it because it's very in the weeds. There's a recent reanalysis of diet fits, actually looking at, I believe, the baseline insulin. They found that there was a difference for specifically the low carb group, if that, from Adrian Sotomoto.
Yeah. So they did a reanalysis, that group, which was very interesting. They looked at the weight of various factors and determining how much in this reanalysis, which is always, when you reanalyze data, remember you're taking the data and looking at it backwards. So there's always a risk of bias there. But what they found was the glycemic load explained, about 2/3 of the weight loss in both arms, meaning like the amount they dropped their sugar explained the weight loss, across both arms. But again, this is years later, when they finally reanalyzed the data, there's never going to be a headline on that, and the sort of the damage was done. But yeah, it's also beyond my pay grade.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think just going back to what Matt had said, emphasizing it should not have been advertised or discussed as a low carb diet or even a low fat diet. And that I think that's one of the big issues, right? It said low carb and low fat are equivalent, but it actually didn't study that. And it was part of the design, which the question is, was it purposely designed in such a way? Because it was already proven that low carb was actually better than low fat in the A to Z. So did they need to change the design to have a different outcome? And that's kind of an open question.
The one thing before you get started on this last point, I know there was a recent study, and it was a well-done study from a group in the UK looking at a low sugar diet, which did not restrict starch. And then they looked at a very low carbohydrate diet. And one of the things they found was not every, that just dropping your sugar, of course, dropping your starch is much more powerful along with dropping your sugar in reducing glycemia. But a lot of improvements just happened with dropping sugar. And I think what I take away on the positive side of this data, because I don't want to be all doom and gloom, is that dropping your sugar is incredibly beneficial, right? And it can benefit you on any diet, whether you're Mediterranean, whether you're keto, whether you're plant-based, just dropping your sugar can help. Certainly, there's more to a ketogenic diet with the benefits it has to offer. But, I think what I took from Diet Fits is dropping your sugars helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I kind of already knew.
Yep. All right. So in this next paper, it was published in 2022. It's titled "The Effect of a Ketogenic Diet versus Mediterranean Diet on Glycated Hemoglobin in Individuals with Prediabetes and Type 2 Diabetes, the Interventional KetoMed Randomized Crossover Trial." They started with 42 people and ended up with 33 at the final. Had some dropouts, a little bit of missing data. It was going on during COVID. And this was a randomized crossover interventional trial. So they actually, every participant did both diets. So initially 20 people ate a whole food ketogenic diet, and 20 people ate the Mediterranean plus diet. And then after 12 weeks, they switched, and the whole food group went to the Mediterranean plus, and the Mediterranean plus went to the whole food ketogenic diet. And then they had 12 weeks where they could really go do whatever they wanted. And that was the end of the study, and they followed up at that point. The intervention in the keto group recommended 20 to 50 grams of carbs per day, 1.5 grams per kilo of protein, to consume non-starchy vegetables, and adequate amounts of sodium and potassium. And on Mediterranean Plus, it was based on the Mediterranean diet pyramid. And extremely important here, the whole food ketogenic diet group was told to stop taking their sulfonylurea medications, so that those can be potent blood sugar lowering medications, whereas the Mediterranean Plus group was told to only decrease those medications by 50%. And we'll be coming back to that. So looking at the primary and secondary outcomes, there was no difference in A1C, and the triglycerides favored the whole food ketogenic diet group, whereas the Mediterranean Plus favored a lowering of the LDL. So their conclusion in this randomized crossover intervention trial among adults with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, the 12-week percentage change in A1C, the primary study outcome, improved significantly for participants on both diets, but was not significantly different between the keto diet and Med Plus phases. Here, looking at weight loss changes, you can see at the end of the study, there's no statistical difference. Their conclusion, we found that both the whole food ketogenic diet and Mediterranean Plus were associated with improved blood glucose and reduced body weight, both of which occurred without guidance on calorie restriction and may relate to the similarities in the two diet patterns, which limited added sugars and refined carbohydrates, or refined sugars. They then created this adherence score to see how well people did at following their diets that they recommended on. And they give people 3 unannounced 24-hour dietary food recalls to kind of keep track of this. And you can see during the food delivery phase that the individuals did very good at following the diet. During the self-provided, it was fairly equal between the two groups, not quite as good as the food delivery stage, but still good. And then at follow-up, you can see that subjects tended to eat more of a Mediterranean Plus diet, and this was at a point where they were told they could eat whatever they wanted. So for the 12-week follow-up, following completion of the 2 12-week phases, participants could choose, again, to follow whatever dietary pattern they preferred. Their conclusion, finally, regardless of benefits, diets need to be sustainable, and our studies suggest it was difficult for participants to maintain the whole food keto diet. And this is from Stanford, Dr. Christopher Gardner. Keto and Mediterranean diets both help manage diabetes, but one is easier to maintain. So, and this is another just quote from the paper that I want to look at. Although reducing carbohydrate intake is often recommended as a strategy to control blood glucose in patients with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, the metabolic benefits and risks of extreme versus moderate carbohydrate restriction are unclear. This is a pretty powerful language to use, extreme. When you look at extreme carbohydrate restriction, almost no results come up. This is not a term that is actually used in medical literature that they chose to use in this paper. Just another little slight against low carb and evidence of bias. Now, I want to take a step back and let's go reinterpret some of the data. So in their own paper, they said, we performed a sensitivity analysis for differential usage of sulfonylurea medication. Out of 7 participants taking sulfonylureas at baseline, 3 used the same dosage for both diets, and 4 used different dosage between the diets. When excluding these 4 participants, we observed significant differences for both A1C and HDL cholesterol between diets, favoring the whole food ketogenic diet. In conclusion, in sensitivity analysis, analysis addressing changes in medications or looking at only the first phase of the crossover, differences between diets for A1C and HDL values shifted to statistical significance, favoring the whole food ketogenic diet. And that, yeah.
I'll interject because I think this is one of the two huge problems I have with this study. And like I said, DietFits was actually a pretty well protocolized study for what it wanted to look at. It just was kind of medialized differently than what I think it should have been. So I want you guys to imagine this. You're going to make a study and you have two groups. You're going to put one group on low carb. You're going to put one group on low fat. They have A1Cs of 10%. And if you put the low fat group on 50 units of insulin and their A1C goes down to 5.2%, whereas whatever the low carb group does, maybe it goes down by a point or two at the follow-up time. That is essentially what they did here. They in their protocol, they differentially changed medicine between the group, and they did not account for that in their final analysis. It is like giving a patient more insulin to artificially lower their A1C and say that, well, there's no difference between the group because the A1Cs are the same. I wouldn't go so far to say it's just egregious. And this group had a MD endocrinologist on their author list. So these people are very smart. Like, they know that this was part of their protocol. And there are ways, I've seen numerous other studies use medication adjusted A1Cs in their final analysis, meaning you can take into account, did we change metformin? Did we change glipizide? Did we change their sulfonylureas? Did we change insulin? And you can normalize that for the A1C. They chose not to do that for this study. And if you look at it, if they excluded those participants, then magically the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet was better for diabetes.
Awesome. That is very well said. Tro, do you want to add anything or?
Yeah, maybe. Well, was there any more slides? I know there was a couple.
I wanted to stop there because that was one of my too heated passion.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna editorialize at the end of this.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll keep going then.
We'll get you.
You know how heated I am about this topic. So I'll put my comments in towards the end, but I agree with you 100%. This is a crime, in terms of wasting nutrition science dollars to then say one arm is going to stop all their drugs and another arm isn't. And then to say that there's no difference for diabetes. Well, I mean, you literally prove the difference. You need less medications with a ketogenic diet. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to let Laura finish because I'm heated about it.
Yeah, it's bad. Okay. So continuing to look at some of the other data that they had, looking at continuous glucose monitors, they said the CGM data was exploratory, and that's because they had not registered it prior. But what they found is that the baseline for the prediabetes group, you can see their average blood sugar dropped from 113 down to 102. And compared to the Mediterranean Plus, the sugars went from 112 to 107. The baseline did not change. So it went from 113 to only 112. So basically unchanged in the Med Plus. When you look at individuals with type 2 diabetes, that's my cursor here, the baseline blood sugar was 152. It dropped by a full 30 points in the keto arm. And remember, that's with stopping more medications. It dropped by 30 points. And in the Mediterranean Plus, it dropped by about 15 points with more medications on board. And I just said that. So the decrease in the average glucose value from the CGM data was significantly lower during the whole food keto diet compared with the Med Plus based on the model. For participants with prediabetes, the effects of the diet on blood glucose were moderate as expected and were greater for the whole food keto diet. So expected, and it was that they were better. Conclusion, although the whole food keto diet was associated with improved glucose control on several CGM metrics, the differences in A1C values were modest, in part because they were on more medication. All right, now let's look at the weight difference for a second. If we just look at the very first phase of this trial, which was a true head-to-head, right? You put one group on the whole food keto diet, one group on the Mediterranean diet. You can see that there actually is a statistical difference between weight loss. The whole food keto diet did lose more weight. And at that point, they crossed over.
No, you got it.
Okay. At that point, they crossed over, and then the difference between the two groups went away. The problem here, though, is they went straight from the whole food keto and Mediterranean plus directly into the second phase of the study, switching the diet. So there was no washout period. So if they had metabolic improvements, which they did clearly, and they had lost more weight, they're taking those improvements, that improved insulin sensitivity, and they're bringing that into their new diet.
Having a crossover nutritional study without a washout period is setting up your protocol to not find a difference between the groups. Essentially, exactly like what Laura said, you're going to bleed the effects out from going from a keto diet. These people already lost significant weight. They lost weight on both diets. And interestingly enough, when they switch, you can actually just visually see on this graph at that red box afterwards, the green line lost more weight and the red line actually regained weight. So they switched over and they regained weight on the other. It just all washes out because it becomes non-statistically significant because they've already had that significant weight loss. You're not going to really expect to have continued weight loss after this first phase. That would be statistically significant anyways. Again, this is part of the protocol that seems to be deliberately written to actually not find a difference between these groups.
In their conclusion and sensitivity analysis addressing changes, this is just to wrap it all up. So we just looked at weight that they kind of tweaked to favor Mediterranean plus, or just like Matt said, get rid of the difference between the two. In their analysis, looking at only the first phase of the crossover, the differences between diets for A1C and HDL shifted to statistical significance favoring whole food keto. So we just showed weight loss favored keto. Now we're showing A1C and HDL also favored keto. As far as the adherence goes, they actually created these adherence scores on their own and deemed how people could get scores. So I don't know the proper way to address a diet adherence score, but it does seem kind of arbitrary. And then to make the statement, it was easier to maintain the Mediterranean plus based on our created adherence score, doesn't sound great to me. Looking at the adherence for the 12-week follow-up following completion of the 2-week diet phases, participants could choose to follow whatever dietary pattern they preferred. And they actually published an entirely separate paper on this. But what I want to point out is at baseline, the difference in the adherence to a whole fat ketogenic diet is 1.4, whereas towards a Mediterranean plus is +1. So in reality, the subjects changed their diets where there's actually starting to eat a little bit more of a whole food ketogenic diet compared to the Mediterranean plus.
One other way of saying that is the people before they started this study were already eating a more Mediterranean diet pattern. And so when they go back to eating the way they were eating, they're of course going to go back to eating near that pattern. So they're gonna be easier to follow Mediterranean because that's what they're already eating. But in reality, once you taught people how to eat keto, they actually changed their diet more to mimic keto than eating their old diet, if that makes sense. So the only reason they said that Mediterranean diet is more sustainable is because people went back to their old diet, which was already close to the Mediterranean diet. That's all it means. And like Laura said, the adherence surveys that you looked at the last page were largely just kind of made out of thin air and not really validated for this. But that's the end of that. Yeah.
So researchers, Matt kind of said this, but researchers concluded it was difficult to maintain the whole food ketogenic diet. But in reality, subjects were told to eat whatever they liked. Subjects' baseline diet was more similar to the Med Plus than the whole food ketogenic, and there was a larger difference towards a whole food ketogenic diet than a Mediterranean Plus. So when we look at our conclusions on the alternative reinterpreted data, we see that actually, in regards to glycemia, blood sugar sensitivity analysis, and weight, the whole food ketogenic diet actually won on every metric. And the takeaway Gardner said is that there was no additional overall health benefit to cutting out legumes, fruits, and whole grains to achieve an ultra low carb diet. For people with diabetes or prediabetes, the less restrictive Mediterranean diet was similarly effective in controlling glucose and likely more sustainable if you want to stay on medications. Instead, the whole food ketogenic diet demonstrated marked improvement in glycemia over the Med Plus diet. Additionally, medications that promote weight gain and cause dangerous hypoglycemia that can be life-threatening were able to be reduced or stopped more effectively on the whole food ketogenic diet. Subjects ended up changing their diets more in the direction of a whole food ketogenic diet than a Med Plus diet. LDL-C increased, but they did not measure ApoB, which is also a better marker and minimally affected by a ketogenic diet when you look at the VertaHealth data.
That's what we believe the conclusion should be.
People don't realize how cheeky they're being. You know?
Yeah, that's
like you may not realize how nice you guys they're actually being, and maybe I'll translate it with my righteous anger in a bit.
Yeah.
So looking back at the news studies, keto Mediterranean diet trial finds slight winner. Which one? The keto diet bans these wonderful things, whereas Mediterranean doesn't. And unfortunately, it continued to kind of support Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead. No,
oh,
sorry.
I was going to say we're going to transition now to the final
No,
study.
just you could leave it. You can leave it up here on your screen.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to. You can go to the next slide though, but I want to come back because this point of a crossover is very difficult to understand, but I'm going to try to make it as super simple as I can. Imagine I fed you steak for 2 weeks. Okay. And then after that, I gave you whatever you wanted to eat. And then I told you, we're going to see how lively you are, how much you're exercising, how much weight you continue to lose. Right. And imagine I gave you 2 weeks of alcohol, same calories. Right. And all you did was drink your alcohol calories. And then 2 weeks later, I said, let's measure how lively you are, how happy you are, and how much weight you lose. If I don't wash over, what's happening is the effect of the diet you were on bleeds into what happens later. And so it's not a proper way to do a trial, one. And I was so furious when I read this, like the minute I read this, I called up Eric Westman and I said, Eric, we can't let them do this. Right? We can't let them do this. So we wrote a letter to the other one saying, how do you conclude in your conclusion that the diets are equal? Right? When you're literally stopping more diabetes medication, this is preposterous. And I don't want to name names, but there are researchers at Stanford who thought that this was an embarrassment. And I was told, and I don't know, that this is what I was told, is hearsay, that this trial, they tried to get it published in several prominent journals and it was rejected. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition is a good journal, very good journal. But they, this didn't pass the muster. So, I felt so strongly about it. I called up Eric and we wrote a letter to the editor basically going through this. And they sort of acknowledged some of the points, but, didn't really, I don't think they really addressed the key issues here because I don't think they want to. I don't think it was an earnest mistake. I think they knew what they were doing. There's no way you can be that smart and do this. That's why when us as doctors, when we see this, you may read these papers as sort of just as a layperson or whatever, and you may say, well, then maybe that's just the way they did it. No, like you have to do this by design. They know what they're doing. This is an intentional thing. There's no way you can do this, specifically changing the difference in medication discontinuation. You know, if I was, you know, that person, you know, on the study, you know, there's no way I would have allowed for that because it's not an equal playing field. So this is an embarrassment, but you know, because he's so prominent in the space, I feel like people turned a blind eye. And I thought it was absolutely inexcusable. And I had my concerns about Gardner. Yes, he's vegan. Yes, he, you know, is part of the True Health Initiative, which is basically the vegan mafia. Excuse me. They were caught. The group of docs associated with the True Health Initiative was caught trying to influence editors on publications that were pro-meat or showed the benefit of ketogenic diets, including academic bullying. They were caught doing this. So when I say vegan mafia, I mean it. This is something that's public knowledge now. So I had my suspicions of Gardner, but it was this study, and you'll see in the next study how it all falls apart. And thankfully, I developed it. This graphic is actually a really great graphic. It's from the paper showing the conflicts of interest with regards to the Dietary Guidelines Committee from Nina Teicholz. She's written about Gardner and Substack. I highly recommend you go out and you subscribe to her Substack, Unsettled Science. This paper was published in the peer review literature. I'll post that other paper in the Toward Health app. So you can access all these conflicts of interest and look at it for yourself. We're going to be analyzing the Gardner twin study and its relationship to the documentary, the Netflix documentary, You Are What You Eat, and the Game Changers documentary. So this is hopefully something you find important. Yeah, so I mentioned this. We're going to walk you through how, after we talk about the study, we'll talk about how Christopher Gardner has accepted money from Beyond Meat to publish other data and how potentially he's been influenced by other vegan contributions. Yeah, so so let's go back, right? So let's go back. Between Diet Fits and the KetoMed study publication, we learned that Chris Gardner accepted money from Beyond Meat to do basically a very faulty study comparing, Beyond Meat hamburgers to hamburgers and trying to make health claims out of them. And we know that the group that he's associated, James Cameron being the director of Game Changers, and the funding from that coming from John Vaught, who's a tech billionaire, sort of part of that vegan mafia. They put money into this documentary called Game Changers through their not-for-profit entities. And James Cameron, just so you know, the guy who did, what is it called, Avatar, he owns a massive, pea protein plant. So they are investing into this space very heavily. Whether they believe in its nutritional impacts, I don't know. But, they're heavily invested in this space. So this all sort of started this unholy trinity between the Vaught, Beyond Meat, and Christopher Gardner started to come into light around the time where the KetoMed study was published. And, we've now learned that the influence that went into this Game Changers documentary, and we'll talk about the influence that went into, the You Are What You Eat documentary, which was literally recorded before the study was published. So they literally recorded this documentary on the twin studies, right, before it was published. Nobody in their right mind would invest money into a trial, right, without knowing the outcomes. So I would just want you all to understand that. They invested over $500,000 into it. And I know Dr. Laura's rushing me along here.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't trying to rush you.
No, it's all right. It's
I'm
okay.
reading your mind.
So perfect. So this study was published in JAMA, and it, Christopher Gardner is the senior author. It was done at Stanford, looking at twins. One group ate a little bit of meat, and one group was given, vegan meat. And you can go to the next study, and I'll briefly sort of walk through the dynamics. They got a bunch of twins together. They got 44 of them. They split them apart, and they gave them these different sort of diets. First, they did meal planning, and then they did self-provided, and they looked at the outcomes, between the twins. So you can go to the next slide. And, just to give credit to them, they looked at all the baseline characteristics, and, as you'd expect, they're twins. There wouldn't be any difference at all. So the groups were equal because they were twins. Yeah. And so what was the outcomes? I won't go too much into the trial design. I think it was 8 weeks of eating, an omnivorous diet, and then one was eating a vegan diet. And what did they look at? I mean, this was the headline. It was huge. It was in JAMA. It was an LDL decrease, okay, of about 10 points, right? It was an LDL decrease of about 10 points. That was it. And if you look here at the rest of the difference, you could see that the HDL, the good cholesterol, also decreased, right? Which is a factor that goes into the 10-year atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk. And the triglycerides increased on the vegan diet. But that was not mentioned in any publication. It raises LDL, it's a better diet. Here's a documentary about it. Meanwhile, it raised glucose, it raised triglycerides, and it lowered HDL. And you can see here the weight was a little bit lower in the vegan group, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And you may say, well, they even reduced insulin, it appears at least, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, right? Yeah, you're going to have to click sort of through. So this was the big thing. This was the primary endpoint. Does it lower cholesterol? Yes, it lowered cholesterol, LDL, by about 10 points. And then they said it also lowered weight. But wait a second, how did that happen? How would we all lose weight if we were forced on a vegan diet? Let me think about that. Well, they reported literally not liking their food and eating less of it. And when they didn't like their food and they ate less of it, they had less insulin, right? Why do they have less insulin? They also, besides hating their food, had much less protein, and they had much less dietary cholesterol, and they also had much less B12. And this was not found in the publication at all, right? I mean, barely mentioned in the publication, and not mentioned on Stanford's website, not mentioned in the, in the news, that it literally, worsened metabolic syndrome by increasing triglycerides and decreasing good cholesterol. So again, this then, and what boggled my mind here was not so much, sort of the conclusions that they came to. It was the fact that they basically knew what they were doing beforehand. They were giving people food that they didn't like to eat. Of course, they're going to eat less, right? And then when they eat less, their cholesterol goes down. They don't get the nutrients they need. They're not getting, they're eating less and less frequently. Their protein's down, their insulin's down, right? And they lose weight because they hate their food. But when they're eating the food you're giving them, their metabolic syndrome is worsening. And that's nowhere listed on any publication. So you can go to the next slide, right? So there was a lot of omissions, right? And they didn't talk about HDL. They didn't talk about triglycerides. And then, simultaneously with the publication of this was the release of the documentary. It was all a publicity stunt. It was all planned. So who's doing this? It's not some, homely Stanford researcher, right? This is somebody who is actually part of a network. And this is the network. So this is Vought. Vought has a foundation. He invests in Beyond Meat. Okay, he also invests directly through the Vought Foundation into the documentaries, Game Changers and You Are What You Eat. Beyond Meat funnels money to the twin study. Vought also funnels money directly to Stanford. And Gardner makes the study, and knowing beforehand what he's doing, he's a masterful designer of studies. We both see that. right? And then he makes a documentary as he's doing the study. So this is like the influence, guys. This isn't like conspiracy. This is fact, right? So, and this is all to push, in this case, they're pushing processed vegan food. Now, I don't know if maybe they believe in the cause. I don't know, right? If they actually believe this or if it's corporate interest or investment interest. I suspect if you're doing this and you're a researcher or an academic, you actually believe this, but I don't know. But it's very complicated. And here is the influence laid out before you so you could see it. It's not a conspiracy. This is real life. Yeah. And the worst part about this is, and my concern is, Gardner's right there, in the Hawaiian shirt in the Dietary Guidelines Committee. And he's gone from being a sort of researcher in my mind to now being an advocate for a vegan agenda. And he is the person who's deciding what your kids eat at school lunch. He is on this committee, along with a Harvard MD, MBA, who has been paid by Novo Nordisk, right? They are deciding, right, with the guy, the pharma company that literally makes the obesity drug that they're trying to give to kids. Actually, 10 members of the DGA committee are sponsored by them, or literally accept money from Novo Nordisk. So this is why I'm concerned, because it's no longer nutrition science. It's gone, it's meshed in with advocacy and corporate interests, and it's a little bit concerning. And this is actually a great paper. The idea here is how do we bring back trust in nutrition science? It's by exposing the people with conflicts, right? And it's by exposing the people with corporate influence, like Gardner. This was an analysis done by Nina Teicholz, looking at the money going to the committee members of the DGA. And you could see that every single member had some conflict of interest, every single one. And you could see one of them, this is an astronomical 150 conflicts of interest. 150, and this is like hundreds of thousands of dollars. They are completely owned, right? So this is a huge issue, guys, and this is very real. The people deciding what's recommended to you, to your parents in nursing homes, to you and your loved ones in hospitals, to what the dietitians are taught, to the doctors that are taught, to what your kids are fed. This is all being decided by people who are just bought and paid for by pharma or food companies. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I'll let you guys finish off here.
So to recap, back in 2007, a very wise man said a low carbohydrate, high protein, high fat diet may be considered a feasible alternative recommendation for weight loss. And then unfortunately, after we don't know exactly what happened, that same individual said, I do not recommend a ketogenic diet, despite his own study showing it's actually one of the best dietary trials, at least for weight loss, they found. And
stopping medications you don't need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, how did we go from this to this? And the answer is you get the results you look for.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. Thank you everybody from social media for joining us. Hopefully you guys liked this and hopefully you found it beneficial. Dr. Matt Calkins and Dr. Laura Buchanan, and I'm Dr. Tro. Thank you everybody for joining us. And this is not a conspiracy. This is your nutrition public health experts. All right, guys, have a good one.
Have a good one.
Thank you guys. Thanks for joining, guys.